Tonight I want to address the question of whether there's any point doing the Band-Aid mod on your stabilizers. There seems to be some debate in the community about whether this mod actually is effective, and it seems to stem from the question of whether the stabilizer slider actually hits the PCB when the key bottoms out. So the reason this is a question is because the Band-Aid mod involves putting a piece of Band-Aid, electrical tape, or other cushion material onto the PCB underneath the stabilizer, so that when your key bottoms out, the slider part of the stabilizer will hit this cushion material instead of hitting the PCB, and then it should be quieter if it hits that cushion material. So if the stabilizer slider isn't hitting the PCB anyway, then this mod wouldn't do anything, right? So let's just test it. There's these three main categories of stabilizers. The left one is vintage stabilizers, vintage GMK or cherry stabilizers. The middle one is Zeal stabilizers, and the rightmost one is a modern GMK stabilizer. Now these two I don't need to test separately because, as you can see here, the Zeal stabilizer is actually dimensionally the same as the GMK vintage stabilizer, or cherry vintage stabilizer I should say. And so since the Zeal is patterned after this vintage stabilizer, I can just test the Zeal stabilizer and it should give me the same results. Now, for the modern, newer GMK style stabilizer, I need to clip it because most people in this hobby are clipping their stabilizers. And if you didn't know, what that means is we're nipping off this little flexible finger that protrudes out the bottom of the stabilizer. Just like that. Just chop it off with some flush cutters. Now, the interesting thing about that is you may have now altered the geometry of this slider. So if you look here, in theory, if this slider is mounted all the way into the keycap stem as far as it can go, you'll see now that the clip stabilizer is not going to protrude downwards as far if it's mounted all the way into the keycap, because we've cut part of the stabilizer off that would normally be bottoming out first. So that makes me wonder whether the clipped stabilizer will give a different result in this test than the Zeal stabilizer. So something to consider. So let's test the old style / Zeal style stabilizers first. So what I wanted to do with this test is look and see whether the slider is bottoming out. So I cut a little viewing window into the side of the stabilizer housing to make it easier for us to see whether or not the slider is hitting the PCB. As you can see here, there's a window, so we can see pretty easily whether it's hitting the PCB. So first, I'll just press this spacebar onto this switch and stabilizer setup. Now first I'll try mounting the keycap by just pressing on the center where the switch is. If I do that, and then I hit the spacebar while I'm typing, if I hit the spacebar towards the center, you'll see that the stabilizer slider doesn't touch the PCB. However, if I happen to hit the edge of the keycap, it can hit the PCB, just barely. You can just barely tap the PCB. So I wondered, could I avoid that by mounting the keycap better? So instead of just pressing on the center, this time I'll press firmly on the two edges. So that should seat the keycap more tightly onto that should seat the keycap farther onto the stabilizer sliders. So if I do that, I can see that there's a little bit more space, but it's still possible. If you happen to hit the keycap just right, it's still possible for it to hit the PCB. that slider can just barely hit the PCB. See that? And I'm not pressing hard. So let's see if the situation is any better for a smaller keycap, like backspace, which is only 2 units. So I'll mount it the better way by pressing down firmly where the stabilizers are. And let's see how it looks here. Once again, if I hit the center of the keycap, everything will be fine. It's not gonna, the slider won't hit the PCB. What if I hit the very edge of the keycap? Could it touch the PCB? Yeah, it can. Just barely. So I think, based on this test, if you're using the old style stabilizers or Zeal stabilizers, you might actually get some effect from the Band-Aid mod. In fact, I think that you probably would some of the time. So you're not always going to hit the edge of the keycap, right? But if you are hitting the edge of the keycap, then this slider could be bottoming out. But in my personal opinion, it doesn't really make sense anyway. Even if the slider hits the PCB, it doesn't really make sense to me to do the Band-Aid mod unless you're using silence switches. If the switches are silenced, then that noise of the stabilizer slider hitting the PCB is going to be louder than the rest of the time when you hit the center of the keycap. So that would be my advice, is to not waste your time doing the mod unless you're doing a quiet build with silent switches. So now let's just check the situation with the new style stabilizers. These are GMK stabilizers that I've clipped. So I'll do the same thing. I'll mount the keycap the bad way and see how things look over here. So it's a little harder to see because everything's black, but there's more space there. So I thought something I could try to make it easier to tell whether it's touching the PCB, since it's hard to see. I thought I would try was to take some powder and dust it onto the PCB, and then if the stabilizer slider hits that powdered part of the PCB, we should see some disturbance in that powder. This is a trick sometimes used in by auto mechanics and in other hobbies and such, to see if two parts are contacting each other. So I'll try that, see. Just kind of try different angles. So I can see the mark in the powder that was left if it touches. So I'm only seeing a mark if I hit the keycap kind of hard. So let's just try that again real quick and double check. Okay, so I don't see the mark. Now I do see the mark. See that on the left side there? The mark appeared. But only if I hit the keycap on the front edge and also at the very right side of the spacebar. And I'm not pressing hard in this case. So let's reset the test here and then repeat it. Gotta erase that mark first. Okay, there we go. So let's just reset here and do it again after I've seated the keycap better. So this time I'll press firmly where the stabilizers are, and that's going to mount those sliders farther up into the keycap stem. Now let's take a look, see if that changes things. Oh, except I've made a mark when I mounted it, so I need to reset the powder real quick. Of course. So just FYI, obviously when you mount your keycaps, the sliders bottom out when you mount the keycaps. That's not what we're testing. That's obvious. Okay, mark is gone. Now I'll do the worst case scenario. I'll push the side of the keycap towards the front. And I'm not pressing hard. You can see the mark there. The very tip of the slider touched and made a mark in the powder there. If you can see it. Let me just try to make it more obvious by making the powder a little more uniform here, so that it's easier to see what I'm talking about. Let's see. Is that better? Okay. I think that's a little easier to see now. Okay. Focus. There's the mark. See that little black dot? So it touched the PCB. So if that happens when you're typing and you hit the edge just right, it's going to make that tapping sound. So once again, if I hit the center of the keycap, the story is different. There's more of an air gap. So let me just reset the powder and show you what I mean. So if I'm only hitting in the center of my keycap when I type, see, no mark. So for the sake of being thorough, we can go ahead and do the same test with the backspace as well. I'll mount the keycap the best way, pressing where the stabilizers are firmly. And I'll reset the powder. Is that a mark? I don't think so. Yeah, it looks like there's, see that? There's a fraction of a millimeter of space. Even if I hit the keycap just right, it's just barely not touching the PCB. It's so close. It's really close. It's like almost like a hair's width, but it's not touching. So after fiddling with these stabilizers a lot and trying a lot of different things, my conclusion here is that, first of all, for the larger keys like your spacebar, that stabilizer slider is definitely able to hit the PCB, regardless of whether you're using clipped GMK stabilizers or whether you're using Zeal stabilizers or vintage stabilizers. In any case, if you hit the key just right at the far side of the keycap, either the left side or the right side, and towards the front edge, it is possible, and in fact we saw it happening, for that slider to hit the PCB, even if I mounted that keycap as securely as I could. However, it's not going to happen all the time, And if you type like most people and you're hitting close to the middle of the space bar, it might not ever happen. So it's hard to say, but it is possible if you hit the keycap just right for that slider to hit the PCB. However, it looks like on the smaller keycaps, like a backspace for example, it's actually less likely. And I think that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because of the geometry involved. With the longer keycap, it's a lot more possible with the tolerances involved for that for the outer edges of it to move more with respect to the center, because you've got a longer distance here. So definitely more possible with a space bar than with the backspace, for example. So the conclusion I got from this is that I wouldn't do the Band-Aid mod unless you're doing a silenced build. And then if you're doing a silenced build, I would do the Band-Aid mod, just because you don't want to every once in a while hear that annoying tapping noise when you're bottoming out and have it sound completely different than the rest of your switches. So since we can see that under certain circumstances, if you just happen to hit the keycap, you know, the spacebar a certain way, you can end up bottoming out on the PCB. I would go ahead and do something like the Band-Aid mod if you're doing a quiet build with like silent switches. But if you're not doing a silenced build, I don't feel like it's worth it, because most of the time that tapping sound isn't going to sound that much different than the rest of your switches, and it's probably not going to bother you that much if you even notice it at all. So hope that video was helpful and will help you decide whether or not you want to do this mod. Thanks for watching, and have a great night.